This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Justin Waggoner, K-State Extension beef specialist, starts today's show as he comments on how mud can be impacting cattle and what producers can do to help their livestock. A speaker from K-State's Swine Profitability Conference, Lisa Tokach, a veterinarian in private practice, continues the show as she touches on a few points from her presentation, 11 Habits of Highly Productive Pork Producers. Ending today's show is K-State Research and Extension Horticulture Agent for Riley County, Gregg Eyestone, as he discusses how drip irrigation helps conserve water use. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our show talking about mud and cattle with K-State Extension beef cattle specialist Justin Waggoner. Justin, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Shelby.
Justin, as we're talking about mud and the impact it can have on cattle production, how much mud is too much mud?
Cattle can handle some fairly muddy conditions, but there's certainly a performance impact. I often think about the human impacts, right? We don't talk about that a lot, but oftentimes, we as producers and cattlemen in general, we have a love-hate relationship with precipitation, right? We need the precipitation to grow forages and crops for our cattle enterprise, but really none of us like mud. I know you and I were kind of talking on air. I think every young person that's had to help their dad open gates on the farm has at some point had their mud boots sucked off, right, in the wintertime. So, that's kind of what I think about with muddy conditions, just to paint that picture. But really, how much mud is too much mud? I think there's certainly a point where we as producers from a cattle comfort standpoint certainly need to intervene, right? And so that's what we're going to talk about today, is a little bit about some of those strategies, intervention strategies. But maybe first, let's just kind of talk about some of the impacts of mud.
And what is the impact for maybe a feed yard style production?
As I think about feed yard cattle and confined cattle, right? So simply put, muddy conditions, especially when they're combined with cold conditions, the primary increase that we're going to see in the impacts of the cattle is going to be an increase in energy requirement. And so what that translates into is reductions in performance. And so, if we think about, how much mud and what is the impact of different levels of mud, well, that can be fairly substantial. So if we kind of think about what's the impact of a few inches of mud. So 4 to 8 inches of mud, kind of the general rule is that's going to reduce cattle performance by about 14 to 15%. As we go deeper, as we get into 12 to maybe 20 plus inches of mud, so we're kind of thinking hawk deep. That is a lot of mud. Really, the reduction in cattle performance at that point is going to be fairly substantial. That's about 25% reduction in cattle gain and performance. If we just frame it in the mind of every 4 days that cattle have to slog through really deep mud in a feedlot, we're going to add another day in terms of cattle days on feed. And, if we start to think about what the impacts of that would be if those cattle aren't gaining weight and we're still feeding them, there's certainly a pretty substantial impact on feed conversion, right? So I put together the focus on feedlots. I thought it'd be really interesting to, there's always a few spikes in the graphs that I put together. And one of those more recent spikes would be the winter of 2018 and 2019 in our focus on feedlot data set. And so I thought I'd go back and, kind of dissect that event here in Kansas. And that was in southwest Kansas, where a lot of those yards are located. We actually had over 30 inches of snow that winter. And so essentially what we saw in our closeout data was that the biggest impact was feed to gain. So essentially what we ended up with was, normal, I would say, feed conversion during that time period. So January, February, March for cattle would be about 6 to 1. What we had in that winter, 2018, 2019, was about a 7 to 1 feed conversion across the average of those 3 months. So you can really see, it certainly added to our feed conversion in terms of the amount of feed it would take to produce a pound of gain, right? So it certainly has an impact on cattle performance, regardless of whether that's a few inches or we get into those really extreme situations in terms of mud. It can certainly have an impact. Now let's talk about the cow-calf side of things. So often when I think about the cow-calf segment of the industry, I think, those cattle are in more extensive environments, right? Maybe mud's a little bit less of a concern. Well, that's not always the case, right? What are we doing this time of year? We're calving, we're feeding cows. So we've got calving locations or pastures, we've got feeding sites to deal with. Mud is still a challenge for that segment of the industry as well. I didn't want to, dwell on too much, but I think there's, what are the impacts on the cow-calf side of things? And so there's a recent, study out of The Ohio State University that looked at a simulated mud environment on some first calf heifers. And so they actually had some heifers in about 7 inches of mud in confinement from 196 to 266 days of gestation, so about a 70-day period in these muddy conditions. And what they found was those heifers that were maintained in those mud lots actually lost almost 180 pounds of weight relative to the control pens. Some other interesting observations out of the study was those heifers, even though they removed them prior to calving, they actually calved a little bit earlier. So there was about a 3-day earlier calving in those cows, those heifers that were maintained in those muddy pens. So there's certainly still that impact on the cow-calf segment as well in terms of that reduction, increases energy requirements, body weight loss, those type of things, they all start to add up. What was interesting to note in this heifer study was none of the calf performance measures, so body weight or anything like that, was impacted. So those cows did really a good job of maintaining that calf and that fetus inside, but the real impact was on their body condition and mobilizing those body reserves. So I think especially with the winter that we're seeing in especially northeast Kansas with the snowfall we've seen, that's certainly something to take note of on the impacts of those mud and what that might be in terms of those producers that are calving right now and going through that.
What is some prep work that maybe cattle producers could do to lessen the impact?
As we think about, the feed yard industry and feed yard pens, for example, I always think about one of the important things to do is to get into those pens in the fall and really make sure that we've done our manure management. We've got those pens cleaned out, especially paying attention to those areas under the fence where we've got drainage, right? We want those pens to be able to drain so we can get those into the lagoon. As I think about, feeding site preparation, there's some great folks with K-State in the watershed department that actually do some work on, developing better feeding sites and using geotextile fabric. I mean, it's, oftentimes we talk about putting down rock and what happens to rock? Well, it just disappears over time, right? So there are some things we can do to develop our feeding sites, especially in a cow-calf enterprise, to be better prepared in the event of wet conditions, okay? So, the first step is preparation in terms of pen maintenance, making sure we have appropriate slope, making sure those feeding sites coming into the winter are going to drain, that we've patched all the holes, we've kind of done our due diligence in being prepared because we never know what we're going to get. So this time of year, I also started thinking about snowfall. I thought we'd talk about that because that's probably more likely at this point. Although I'd like to think that we're on the downhill side of winter, right? We are most likely probably going to see a little more snow if we do see precipitation, right? So one of the common things in the feed yard industry is we want to get that snow removed from the surface of the pen as possible. And the same thing is true for feeding sites, right? So if we've got a site that's already wet and it gets more snow on top of it, one of the things about snow is it doesn't run off, right? So it's important to go in and clean off any of that additional snow, pile that somewhere else away from those feeding sites, or even remove it from those pens if possible. One of the frame of references that I guess I'll kind of share with the listeners is, the importance if we think about a really muddy pen surface in a feedlot and we take a box blade and we start to just move this layer of slop and mud out of the way, it's very common to see those cattle in those areas that have just recently been cleaned to move into those areas and lie down because they're seeking out a dry place to lay down. You kind of think about that as a frame of reference that I think that illustrates how important that additional cleaning step is to get into those pens or those feeding sites and start to clean those areas off if we do get additional precipitation. Something else that I feel that helps us on as well is as we get wet, muddy conditions and it freezes, what also happens to the surface of that pen? Well, it becomes, or that feeding site, it becomes incredibly rough as it freezes in those overnight and those early morning hours. So it's not uncommon to also see cattle, we see an increase in lamenesses, right? This time. So getting into those pens, cleaning off that additional moisture, it really serves twofold. It cleans it off, allows it to drain better, but it also can reduce the impacts potentially on lameness and just make it easier for those cattle to get around. So another mitigation strategy would be bedding cattle. And that's kind of a, common practice. And so, what do we bed with? How much bedding, how much square footage, do we need per animal? Those are all really kind of great questions. Here in Kansas, I would say the most common forms of bedding that we would use would be straw or corn stalks. And so really what we're trying to do there is just simply give those cattle a dry place to lay down, right? And so there are some rules of thumb in terms of the amount of bedding. However, the rule that I kind of like to use is that we really just want those cattle to be comfortable. So as I think about, how much surface area do we need in encompass, usually it's about 20 to 40 square foot per animal. The amount of bedding, kind of depends on the situation that we're dealing with, right? As I think about a really muddy pen surface and getting those cattle out, it may take more bedding to do that. One of the downsides of bedding that we have to take into consideration is at some point we're going to have to deal with that additional biomass that we've put on the pen surface. We need to go in and get that removed. And so there is an additional cost associated with bedding cattle when we have to remove that from the pen surface. In terms of feeding sites, typically we don't get back into those areas until, I would say, summertime or prior to fall as we start to think about that. And so we don't want to forget to come back into those areas, remove that additional bedding. There's lots of downstream consequences, from fly problems and just further degradation of the feeding site later on. But we certainly want to get back into those areas, when we can, when things dry out and get things cleaned out. So another great strategy for dealing with mud is simply to spread cattle out. And I know that sounds kind of easy, but sometimes that's really difficult for us to do in the feed yard industry, which, simply move cattle into an open pen. If you're a cow-calf operator, that can be a little more challenging. But as you start to think about those heavy use areas, the semi-confined, the calving pastures, are there some strategies where you can spread some cattle out, maybe bring a group in and rotate those or do some other things to start to spread cattle out so that we get less degradation of the pen surface and the feeding sites in those areas.
Justin, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thanks, Shelby.
That was K-State Extension beef cattle specialist Justin Waggoner. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking with the speaker from K-State Swine Profitability Conference, who's a veterinarian in private practice, Lisa Tokach. Lisa, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Lisa, your presentation at Swine Profitability Conference, 11 Habits of Highly Productive Pork Producers, and today just touching on a few of those, and the first one for us to talk about the importance of a teamwork atmosphere.
Sure. We all understand the concept of team, but it's really nice when, a team can work together towards a common goal and use good communication skills to kind of get the job done. It just makes the day go better for everyone and hopefully helps us to be more productive in the end.
And some value of it being a full team over departments?
Yeah, one of the points that I talked about in my talk is I really like if a team is going to implement like a bonus program, I really like it to be something that the whole team works for and not just departmental because, for example, in a sow farm, if we have some goals for how many pigs per sow per year we're going to produce, everybody has to work together to achieve that goal because, you can have times when if the goals are by department, it might be how many sows are we breeding per week? Are we meeting breeding target? Well, then sometimes in order to just meet breeding target, they might breed some sows that are less than desirable, or we might not work as hard towards the things that are going to get us to pigs per sow per year. So I like it when we can have goals that everybody has to work together in order for that to happen.
And what are some styles of teamwork or people coming together as a team that you've seen in your extensive years in the swine industry?
I like it when managers communicate all the way through the entire team. So when I walk into a farm and ask, hey, what was the pre-weaning mortality rate last week? And everybody knows what the pre-weaning mortality was, not just the owner or not just the manager. That tells me that they have goals and that they are communicating because everyone is working towards it and it's not some big black mystery. So So I like it if they have communication skills that work for everyone.
And another point you made, another habit you spoke on, was a solid community involvement. And what do you mean, and why do you find that something so important?
Well, I think a lot of people in agriculture understand that not everybody always speaks favorably about agriculture. You know, there's some negative concepts going around of like the evils of factory farming, or, they just don't understand. And we don't let people into our pig barns because of biosecurity. And sometimes that causes problems. People don't know what's going on. And so sometimes the stories they can make up are not favorable. So I like it, even though we're not going to invite the public to come into the pig farms because of biosecurity. We can do our job in educating by speaking to civic groups or just participating in the community, being active on social media to show what we're actually doing, and how it has a positive impact not only in the community but it really in the world. We are producing high quality protein to feed the world.
And another habit that you found really important, and I think a lot of producers, whether it's swine or anything, good animal welfare policies. And what good animal welfare policies, what are aspects of it that you find are critical?
Certainly. And this kind of goes back again to educating the public. If we can show the public that we have good intentions on how we're taking care of the animals, and one of those is just by having good welfare policies. So that would be things like, not everything goes perfectly. You will have pigs that go lame, or you will have a pig that has a tail bite, or, whatever that might be. We need to impress upon everybody involved in the farm that's an emergency to that pig. It might not be an emergency, seem like an emergency to you at the moment, but it is to that pig, and that means we need to act accordingly. And a lame pig that's down in the pen should not have to sit there till the end of the day when we have time to take care of it. That pig might be dead by then, so we need to move that pig to a hospital pen and give it appropriate care right now. And so those are the kinds of things that we talk about as veterinarians when we visit the farm, of what is the culture, what is our attitude towards animal welfare, beyond just the obvious things like, okay, well, don't hit the pigs and don't kick the pigs, and of course we want to treat them respectfully, but it's also just paying attention to those small details and taking care of business.
Is it something you see that is constantly evolving?
Certainly. I've been in the business for a long time, and when I first started as a new graduate, people we didn't talk about animal welfare. People were like, well, they're my pigs and I'll raise them how I want to raise them. And, that's not really the world we live in today. We have consumer input as to, how they want the meat that they're going to eat. They want to know that it's been raised with good animal welfare practices, and the customer is right. So, and I'm happy about that, because obviously we want to have good animal welfare practices. It's good for us too. It's good for the animal, and it's good for production.
Technology, another one of those habits that you see highly productive pork producers using. And what are some technologies and evolution of technologies you've seen?
Well, the amazing thing is with availability of internet services on the farms, is we can use a lot of applications. We can have a lot of apps and a lot of internet-based services, whether that be records or I have a lot of farms that they can control ventilation. The manager of the farm can not even be on the farm. They can be at home, or they can be somewhere else, and they can check to see, what is the temperature in the farrowing house, and it's too low or it's too high, and I can make ventilation adjustments from my phone, which is, amazing that they can be anywhere that they have phone service, and control that, which allows us to, do a better job by the pig. It's not that, oh my gosh, well, it's suddenly we had a cold snap and, we have too many fans running and, it's 20 miles to drive back to the farm. And so, maybe it doesn't get done or it takes too long to get done. And now we can do it with the press of a button in about 10 seconds.
What is your favorite technology?
Ooh, that's a hard one. I've asked a lot of, as I've prepared for this talk, I've been asking a lot of managers, what technology they couldn't live without. And I do love the ventilation aspect of technology. I think that's great. I do love the real time. As a veterinarian, I probably love the real time records keeping. Like I can stand behind a sow in a farm and they can pull up the record and tell me, what's the parity of this sow? How many pigs did she have last litter? When did she start farrowing this morning? I mean, I can have real-time information to make real-time decisions, and I love that. I also love some of the feed delivery information that I can have the feed mill monitor the level of my feed bins, and so it can help me avoid feed outages, which are important everywhere, but especially in that finisher pig where you have them on full feed, and it's actually bad for their health if we run out of feed. And so we can anticipate feed deliveries real time. And I just think there's so many technologies out there. Every time I go to a continuing education meeting, I see something else that I go, oh my gosh, that's so awesome. And obviously we can't invest in all of them. I mean, we have to be financially and fiscally responsible, but some of the tried and true ones have been just really awesome additions.
Lisa, as we wrap up today's conversation, what are a few things you've seen when you go to different swine operations that you've seen are just really important and are consistent across highly productive and successful ones?
I would say probably, like I reiterated in my talk, I think the number one thing is that they're very aware of what their production costs are and what their production goals are, so that the team can work together to try to strive to meet those achievements. The more that they know, and the more real time that it is, then the more success that they have.
Lisa, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
All right, thank you. Thanks for having me.
That was veterinarian in private practice and speaker at K-State Swine Profitability Conference, Lisa Tokach. If you'd like to hear her other habits of highly productive pork producers, you can find it on ksuswine.org, as they will post her presentation. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. A variety of factors determine the success of a garden, and water is certainly at the top of the list. For the February K-State Garden Hour, K-State Research and Extension Horticulture Agent for Riley County, Gregg Eyestone, discussed how to maximize water efficiency through drip irrigation.
Water is one of our hot topics at K-State Research and Extension, and want to make sure that we're focusing on our water quantity and quality. Water is not readily available to us. We don't have an endless supply. And as gardeners, we need to utilize that water the best we can. Many of our irrigation practices may have wasted quite a bit of that irrigation water. So we want to do a better job at keeping that resource available and utilizing it. Our irrigation systems do need some maintenance. It's not necessarily carefree. Some plant growth strategies you may want to consider. Some of our plants, we're just trying to maintain them, keep them alive. And so those are probably going to use less water, less frequent water applications. And so that may be a plant strategy that you want to implement, but maybe you're trying to really increase the growth. And so we're probably going to need to do a little more supplemental watering is what I like to call it. So you'll need to add water when the plants are needing that. So as far as an example in our soils, what we're working with is the pore space. We say that's about 50% of what's available in the soil profile. Ideally, if you're trying to grow your plants quickly and as healthy as you can, if you're growing them for commercial production and or trying to sell them, we kind of like to keep that soil profile about 25% water, 25% air. So maybe the drip irrigation runs every day, but you let it dry out to a little bit. So you're kind of keeping it at that even 25% air, 25% water. Probably harder to do in the landscape itself than it is in a commercial operation or a greenhouse, but that may be our goal. It just depends on what your goal is for your plants. When we think about irrigation, this kind of comes to my mind, seeing that sprinkler head pop up and shoot water droplets or fine mist everywhere. And in some situations, that may be a good thing, but probably even our most efficient overhead, above ground type of irrigation is 75%, 83% efficient. Drip irrigation, you can get at least 95% efficiency on that. They are very effective as far as providing water to the plants. There's still a place for some hand watering. Obviously, when you just plant a plant, you're probably going to use some type of overhead hand watering. My process is collect rainwater off the roof, but there is still place for hand watering even with any of our irrigation systems that we decide we want to try to use. So now we're getting into more of the drip irrigation. Drip irrigation emitters going to drip water slowly and directly into the soil, most water conserving method. Again, it's 95% effective. The drip irrigation is going to work by placing that water slowly directly into the soil. Many small water emitters typically are utilized and placed one or more at each plant in the emitter line, which is snaked around the planting bed. And drip is excellent for watering slopes. Many of us may not just have a flat land that we're trying to irrigate. And so this is very good as far as providing water evenly. I think that's the thing about drip irrigation is it provides that even amount of water throughout whatever the irrigation system's in. We had that spray head, and there's going to be areas that get more water and less water. And so these are very efficient way of making sure we're getting good distribution of our irrigation supply. Only about half as much water may be needed by using the drip irrigation, and we're going to be watering only the root zone. Going to have less money spent for water that we don't need or gets wasted. No wind displacement. Diseases may be lessened because of the foliage remaining dry, and less weeds because the aisles remain dry. You're just watering the desirable plant and not the weeds. Colorado State Extension has a good publication for home drip irrigation systems, and K-State has one for community gardens, so we do have that resource available for you as well.
That's K-State Research and Extension Horticulture Agent for Riley County, Gregg Eyestone, with tips for maximizing water efficiency through drip irrigation. To view the full webinar, search online for K-State Garden Hour, then click on Recorded Webinars. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.